problem with science fiction is we all feed off each other. That's why they all start to look the same. How do I do this different? How do I get your attention? Have you had bad dreams, bad chills? That's really kind of stopped me doing science fiction, because I thought, you know, how is it going to be different? How is it going to be new?
It's really terrifying when you start to delve deeper what can happen to the human body when things go wrong, genetically speaking.
What if the entire movie is about humanity, us, in the future, challenging this scientific idea of creation? Where did we come from?
What we thought we knew in the first Alien is just a tiny tributary of what's actually going on.
We've tackled a lot of new ground, which open up the door to a kind of different form of thinking. Get bolder, get braver, dare to talk about who made us and who made them.
I think you've got to give the fans something new, and you've got to maybe sort of upset them a little bit, or take that risk.
I said I have an idea for a follow-through on the original 4 Aliens, because you really wrung it dry. 4 films on Alien as a franchise is pretty good. Inevitably, it's a prequel.
The idea of returning to Alien, and particularly of bringing Ridley back to Alien, had been floating around for years, and a lot of people had taken a run at it. The day that I got into it, I was not even ostensibly going to a meeting about the project. I just went into Scot-Free to talk generally about writing projects. And they kind of popped it to me across a desk without warning. You know, we thought about going back to Alien. And I said, Alien? Back, well, and I sort of walked through the films in my head, and by the time you get done with the 4 orthodox Alien movies plus Alien versus Predator, the mythology is so dense I wouldn't have the foggiest idea how to write the next one, where on earth you'd go from there. And they said, oh, we feel the same way, we'd go back.
There's one question no one asked in all 4 movies, much to my amazement and surprise. No one said, who's the big guy in the seat that became known as the space jockey? I don't know who gave it that name. Somebody called it a space jockey. It's not in the film. This guy sitting in his chair in the middle of this craft, clearly a craft, was a big question. Who was that?
I'd never thought about it before, but I discovered instantly that I had all these opinions, and I just started mouthing off in the room. I got very opinionated. Well, you'd have to go back to the shipwreck from which it all sprang, and you'd have to look at that dead giant. The space jockey, the dead giant in the chair with the elephantine proboscis, a rib cage. What do you do if you're gonna go make a movie about that guy and his comrades on some big starship? They look ridiculous, they'll be unintentionally funny, we won't relate to them because they're not people, they're gonna speak some language we don't understand. How do you do it? And it seemed very plain to me that the only way you could go dive into the story of the space jockeys is if their story was ultimately ours. If their story led back to us. They needed to be intrinsically involved in the human story, in human history, and I thought in our evolution.
I first heard about the fact that Ridley was considering coming back to Sci-Fi and that he was going to do maybe an Alien prequel, and I think what I was hearing the same thing that everybody else was, which is he was very interested in this massive corpse that was sitting in a chair in the beginning of Alien and sort of telling a story from the point of view of, okay, well, what was that? And how does that plug into the mythology? And I think, you know, sort of every bone in my fanboy body was just sort of vibrating. Oh my God, I can't wait to see that.
Then that evolved, and from that evolution I pitched to Fox, and Fox said, wow, that's a really interesting idea. And that's where we started to evolve into pre-visitation. Have we been pre-visited before? And the more you climb into it, the more you realize it's entirely logical.
The notion that our gods really came not from the heavens, but from the stars, from other worlds. And there's sort of no shortage, obviously, of this kind of theorizing and mythologizing, from relatively serious scholarship to wild conspiracy theories, saying that the pyramids, the Inca temples, the Greek astronomers, all of this ancient wisdom, these old accomplishments, were assisted by powers from beyond the stars, that we ourselves were shaped by something else.
It's entirely illogical to believe that we haven't been visited before, because there's 2 points of arrogance attached to that idea. One is to believe that we're it in this entire galaxy. There has to be more, not humanoids necessarily, but more other life forms. And it's arrogant for us to believe that we are superlative, as opposed to we may be minor.
The next day, the head of Ridley's company called and asked me to write that down for him because he wanted to show it to Ridley. You're not supposed to write anything down as a screenwriter without a contract. And I immediately wrote it down, and they sent it off to Ridley, and they told me it would only go to Ridley, and it immediately shot into the studio and up the ladder all the way to the top of the studio, and within 10 days I was sitting in front of the co-chairs of Fox, and we were locking it down. And after that, I worked as fast and as hard as I've ever worked on anything. Ridley and I, and Michael Costigan and Michael Ellenberg, we just spent months in the room, hashing out story, going around draft after draft, and finding our way to the story.
Who would fly a spaceship filled with these horrible creatures on it? What would possess anyone to do that, human or alien? And that's the real question he was always sort of curious about. What would motivate someone to do that? And so the whole premise from the beginning, and what then became and now is Prometheus, that idea still is what the movie is. And there's something sort of been very pure and very special about the development of this, because it became about who would make monsters.
We began with Giger's monster. We began with the Beast. That's the core of the franchise. It's the core monster. As a new frontier to explore, we looked at these giants, these engineers, as I called them, the aliens who had shaped us, the old gods.
I came up with saying, what happens if these guys exist, and if they do exist, who were they? And I always figured that pilot was flying a battleship, and the battleship was a carrier of deadly objects. The deadly objects were the eggs, and the eggs were the DNA that would be carried out to destroy, would be used to destroy. What would they be destroying?
The farther we push into the development of the story, the bigger the engineers got, and the more marginalized the original alien monster became, until that monster became a kind of feature or grace note in a larger story that was about humanity meeting its makers, humanity confronting the forces that had created it and maybe not liking them that much.
Spates did a lot of the foot slog and a lot of the stuff around the table with me going, yeah, but what about this and what about that? And this will be, Holloway, are you seeing this?
Coming down the ramp?
Yeah, that's when you go to the Magellan Bridge. If there's 6 people, I'm going to have 6 helmets, all got screens on them, all moving. A very good example of their race, so he's kind of like perfection.
Yeah.
Right. Why would you want to find out about who these people are and who made this and who made what? I tend to lob in kind of little milestones in the story saying, there's this and this and this, and when it rams it, guess what? It doesn't destroy it. It comes down, bounces, it bowls it, so it goes down, hits the ground, starts to roll like a frisbee across the landscape, and then rolls after them. I come up with those ridiculously large ideas because mainly I think I can pull that off. And then it's how do you organically roll those into it.
He spitballs freely and creatively all the time, and always visually. He's always sketching and drawing. So that iterative process had been underway for months. We would sit and talk, and he would draw things, and sometimes just stuff he was making up off the cuff, and often things ruinous to the story that I'd written for that week. I'd bring in pages, and he would kick my sandcastle down, because what if this was happening? What if there was a, what do they call that thing where they model a solar system like an orrery? He's like, what if there was an orrery? And I'm like, what would that look like? And he starts sketching, and then I have to figure out what that is and what its meaning in the story will be and what role it will play. And so I throw my pages away and go write new pages. This is an early draft of the script, which I wrote and rewrote and handed in again and again. And this one is one that's been marked up by Ridley himself. And in the early going, you can see the fine detail on which he offered feedback and had strong opinions about individual images, individual words, shadows and light, everything. And I would go through and sort of implement his notes, and highlighting is me telling myself I've done the work I need to do. So we get the side notes, the complimentary ones, better, this is great, but watch out, don't get too much like this. So you get notes as general as, come on, do better than this, be more mysterious, and notes as specific as, I hate this word, use another word.
Conceptually, I think the first draft that I read had a lot of potential and was stimulating visually to an extent that opened up the universe that I had always seen as a claustrophobic interior movie, suddenly became much more involved with the exterior landscape and exploration of it. And that was very interesting, and also suggesting what the civilization that was behind the encounter in the first movie might have been.
Once the story got about 4 drafts in, we started staffing up, and Arthur Max came aboard as our production designer and artists under him, and really began to push the design of the film.
It's very difficult to build a world of science fiction when you have only a static object and a room to begin with.
I would literally come in and write some new pages, come in and talk to people about them. Ridley would go home and I'd go down to the art room and I'd hang out with Arthur and his artists, and we'd sip a glass of wine and talk about the monsters and what they ought to be like and how we think the scene really looks. And I would go home and come back in at 9:30 the next morning, and there would be paintings this wide on the wall of the scene I wrote the day before.
That group then started in a very intimate way that was really, I think, enriching for Ridley. It took the process that he applies in all of his movies, and these kind of big design movies, he was able to sort of take that process and apply it to a world of science fiction. The concept work on this movie was sort of its own script work, and that was script work taking place alongside the actual script work.
Often I'd walk into that room of artists and I would see Ridley's footprints, and there'd be post-it notes and guys saying, that's got to come down, and Ridley wants this head shaped like that, and this needs to be whiter, and that needs to be desexualized, and this needs to be darker and more haunted looking, and artists would be tearing stuff up because Ridley'd been through and reinventing it with his vision stamped on it, and then I would see that vision and see where Ridley was going and carry that home when I wrote my new pages.
And as a fleck, they can go away and there'd just be a plastic window which will come back up if you want it.
Yep.
Screens will probably be just that simple, right?
Yeah. In the first drafts of the film, where the monsters and the monstrous complications that our heroes ran into were much more on the model of the classic alien monster: eggs, facehuggers, impregnation, chest bursting. The entire complex of the engineers that you'll see in the film, the pyramidal temple, the underground catacombs, the huge caverns, those weren't there yet. In the very first conceptualization of the film, the exploratory ship made a search, found a beacon, and set down beside what would ultimately prove to be the shipwreck, the derelict from the first Alien film, a crescent-shaped ship. In exploring that ship, our explorers got into trouble, and as they began to meet and find the remains of the engineers and ultimately a living engineer whom they revived, they were tangling with menaces along the way, which were recognizable ancestors of the beast, the demon from Alien.
What I'm trying to do is reinvent the facehugger. Right. Okay.
In the early phases, the project was actually called Alien Prequel. It was an early development. We didn't know what it was going to be. We had parts of the script that we had read, early on, and there were chest bursters, there were facehugger type creatures, there were things that were more directly you could correlate to Alien. I had done paintings of a creature that was going to come out of one of the character's chest. Now you're going to see these tentacles poking out, and then it would pull itself, it would open up the ribcage and actually release itself through the person. But Ridley felt it was too on the nose, and he kind of wanted to depart from that. He wanted to do things that were more subtle but scarier and not as on the nose as the original Alien.
Those are things that are decided around a table, and then off that over-rich stew, Lindelof comes in and goes, I really like the script, but we could do this, 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 and this. And so Lindelof will go, thoom, carves through it, and suddenly I've got a 3-act piece. 3-act selling tool that I can make into a 3-act film.
What if the sequel to this movie was not Alien, but it was an entirely different movie that started running parallel to Alien, Aliens, or whatever, so that while this would certainly take place in the Alien universe, and there would be all the sort of bells and whistles of what we come to expect from what Ridley originally did, in terms of the tone of it, the way that it looked, but also in terms of how hypersleep works. So maybe it's not a prequel at all. Maybe it's an original science fiction movie that sort of trades in the same stock but really focuses on the story. That being said, all the things that I loved about John's work was that he seemed very interested in this idea of the engineers.
I think, frankly, that he was brought aboard because at the time that I was working on that script, I'd never had a movie produced, and in the view of a studio head, untested. It really happened when we were in the very home stretch. Like, we think we're ready to go, and the studio had two thoughts. They were like, let's dial back the alien monsters and lean more on the engineers, and let's get a known writer on this and bring it home. Which, of course, I didn't love, but which, as an unproduced writer at that time, I had been told to expect from the very beginning, so I wasn't that surprised. And they talked to a number of writers, and Damon was the guy who got it, in their view, and really seemed to love the story for what it was, to understand its soul, and to be happy to carry forward in the spirit of what had been done so far.
Maybe it's a day later as they're trudging to the next silo, you have the birth of the silverfish that comes out of the body of the engineer and comes for her. I think that's the end on the end.